Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Members Monday number 2. Again, I'm pumped for Members Monday. I've been looking forward to this all day, quite literally. So fantastic to be here again with you. Let's see who's in the chat. Bart's already said hello in the chat. Hello, Bart, and welcome. I can see a couple of other people watching, so you don't have to lurk in the chat. There we go. You don't have to lurk in the chat. Let me know if you're here. Sorry, I've just sorted the sound out. Let me know if the sound is okay. So Bart, let me know, is the sound okay? Can you hear me? Now, today's topic, we had a great suggestion come in from Cameron, and Cameron is a new member, so thank you so much for your support, Cameron. And Cameron is asking about worksheets and workbook change macros. Now, what on earth does that mean? And I'm sometimes reluctant to do topics that are kind of technical topics. Thank you, Bart, for saying the sound is good. Technical topics where somebody says, can we just do some cool code? Because my approach is always, the code is only cool if it works. The code is only cool if it creates value for somebody in real life. I don't really like just doing code for the sake of doing code, you see. So I'm always a little bit reluctant when people say, can we look at this coding technique? But this particular one is a really good question. And it's a technique I use in my projects. It's not the first technique I use in my projects. It's not the first technique out of the toolbox, but towards the end of the project, when you're putting the icing on the cake and you're putting some cool features and you're getting that slick functionality, that is when this could come into play. So it could make your application into a really, really cool one. Now, I figured for Members Monday, what it would be good to do is work on a user file, and then maybe over time we can develop a single file into something really cool. I don't know. So Bart, I know Bart's in the chat. I'm using your file, the file we began with last week. So Bart's file last week, if you haven't seen it already, you can go back and see Members Monday number 1, where we were talking about dynamic ranges. And like this itself, it is really cool. I love this stuff. So for example, we've got start times along here. So I can go ahead, put a start time in here, 7:15. And then this list is going to change according to that start time we've entered. So now we can see we've got this list here. If I change this start time to 7:30, now you can see the list ends with 15:36 there. So this is our dynamic lists live stream. You can see last week's stream if you want to know more about how to do this. But I've got a question for you. What if you had to criticize this? Let me know, Bart. With any solution, there's pros and cons. Bob, welcome. How are you? Fantastic to see you. Thank you for your support, Bob. I think you signed up over the weekend. Welcome to Members Monday. And there's three or four of us now, and there's 2 of us active in the chat at the moment. So Bob, ask as many questions as you can. I want to create some value for you. I think you're tuning in from New York, Bob, and you told me in the email it was really cold up there. So it's really cold in the UK as well. Anyway, so I'm suspicious when people say this solution is going to work in every situation. This solution is best. It's just like universally good. I'm very suspicious of that. Any solution has pros and cons. So what are some of the cons? What are some of the bad points of this solution? Can you see any particular problems? I've got one I'm going to show you. So, and it's actually illustrated really nicely right here. So we've got start time 7:30, end time 15:21. Yeah, that's a problem for you. That's a problem for us. Yeah. And Bart, can you see the problem here? Because start time 7:30, end time 15:31. Well, that's not even in our end time list for this start time. So we've got some kind of inaccurate inputs. Why do we get that problem? We get that problem if we have something in the end time cell, then the user goes back and changes the start time. That's going to give us the problem. I can see, Bart, you're saying yes in the chat, so I think you're understanding me. So what are we going to do? Are we just going to blame the user? Well, it's always tempting to just blame the user, but in business, the customer is always right. It's our job as programmers to make the user's life easier. We can never blame the user. And this is a perfectly reasonable thing the user might do, and it might get confusing for them. So yeah, and Bart is saying in the chat that that really is a problem. So let me know, Bart or Bob or anybody else we've got, what might be a solution to this? Can you think of a solution? And can you link it back to our initial conversation we had about the technical content of this session? That's a critical skill. Can you bridge between the application and the technique? That's a process of translation. See if you can do that. Let me know in the chat. Have you got any ideas? Bob says I missed the beginning. Yeah, Bob, the subject, the topic of the feed, is the topic of the stream rather is, I thought I had the topic there, but I don't. The topic is, you can see at the top here, cool worksheet change macros. So these, Bob, are macros that are triggered when we make a change to the worksheet. And let me know, Bob, if you've worked with these before. So there's different ways of triggering macros. We can trigger a macro with a button. We can trigger a macro from the VBA editor. We can trigger macros through worksheet or workbook changes. Yeah. And this is the point of the stream. So maybe you don't understand yet. Don't worry. I'm going to explain it with this demonstration. So Bart's saying, can we make an if condition on the time? Good idea, Bart. I like your thinking. Yeah, we're not going to do this, but we could have a cell here, for example, Alt-HOW on the Windows PC, Alt-HOW. We could have a cell here saying, you know, let's just say problem. And we could have an if statement saying, okay, if the value in this cell is not in the list for this time, so it's not in the 8:30 list, then we could have, an if statement here just making the word problem flash up. So that's a good idea. And that's an example of good support, good communication with the user. And I've implemented solutions like that. In a future stream, we'll have a look at how to do something like that. F4 key, repeat the last action. But I've got a better solution for this one. This solution is going to involve, can you guess? It's going to involve a worksheet change macro. Super cool. A worksheet change macro. Now, before, I'm sorry to keep you waiting for the good stuff, but before we start this, we do have a little health warning that comes with worksheet and workbook change macros. That is that they should be used sparingly. So we shouldn't have 10, 12, 15 of these macros. I might have 1 or 2, maximum 3 in any single workbook. That's because these macros trigger without the user asking them to trigger. Yeah, so they can be confusing for the user. If the user clicks a button, they're expecting something to happen, right? We know that. It's just like in your car, if you hit the air conditioning, you're expecting something to happen. But there's also lots of processes going on in the background. This is like a background process that the user isn't triggering. The user's not expecting it to happen, so it can get confusing. That's why I mean use these sparingly. So let's get into the VBA editor. And Bob and Bart, anybody else with us? If you're watching, you can open an Excel file. And just see if you can work along with me here. So we're used to having, if you've been watching my videos anyway, you'll be used to inserting modules. Okay, let's go ahead and insert a module quickly. And don't get me wrong, this is good practice. And this is where the code lives. We have option explicit. We can give the module a name. All of this remains. This is good practice. As I said, what we're doing today is like the icing on the cake. It's not the cake itself. So what we can do, another place we can store code is, have you ever thought about these objects here? We've got a workbook object here, double click. We've got a sheet object here. And then for each sheet in the file, we have an object, or a representation rather, of the object that sheet is. So indeed, a good way to find how many sheets are in the file is by going into the VBA editor. You can see all of them, including the hidden and the very hidden ones. Cameron is here. Cameron, welcome. Cameron, this lecture is for you. We're doing worksheet and workbook change macros. I can't go back to the introduction now because Bart and Bob have been watching for a while and a couple of other people. But Cameron, you'll have to watch the replay. So these live streams, they will remain available forever as long as you keep your membership going. So you can go back to the start, okay? But hopefully you'll be able to just pick things up. So we can also put code in these objects here. Whoa, incredible. That is like mind blown. You know, when I first heard about this, I was like, that's incredible stuff. Unbelievable. And when you see what we can do, I know you're going to be impressed. So go ahead. Let's hit sheet 2 data. Sheet 2 data. Something to bear in mind, an important thing is this is only going to work if we're on this worksheet. Okay, so we're on the data sheet in the file. And so I'm going to make sure I'm on data here. So we can double click here. Then we're going to go up to the top. And then you're going to go to worksheet. This is another step people often forget. If you're on general, you're not going to see anything. Go to worksheet, and then immediately we get this option up. This isn't the option we're going to use, but it gives us a kind of default option. So what on earth do these options mean? That's just like a lot of code there, you know, for the layperson. It's not easy. Go over to this little menu on the right. Then we've got different options here. And this gives you a sense of the power at our fingertips if we're using this kind of macro. But as I said, has to be handled with care. Should you be using all of these? Absolutely not. Maybe you're using 1 or 2 in any particular application. So when these things happen, we can trigger some code. When this sheet is activated, we can trigger a macro. When there's a change in this sheet, we can trigger a macro. So Bart, is this connecting with you now? When somebody changes a value in the sheet, we can trigger a macro. When we go off this sheet, select another sheet, we can trigger a macro. We can do all these things with pivot tables. It's going to get so complicated. We're not going to do any of that, don't worry. In fact, I've never used any of these pivot table ones, which maybe gives you a sense of how kind of obscure, you might say, some of this functionality is. But this gives us a sense of how we can trigger these macros. So just talking in layman's terms here, let me know in the chat which of these events, so remember each of these is an event, something that happens in Excel. We're not going to go too far into the computer programming stuff, the technical stuff, nor do I really understand it myself, but this is all stuff that can happen in Excel. You know, we can activate the sheet in Excel. We can make the sheet calculate using the F9 key. We can move off the sheet. These are events, things that might happen. So we're going to use this change event. So when we change something on the sheet, we want something to happen. I'm going to go ahead and delete this code that was automatically generated. I'm going to go ahead and delete that now. Keep it as simple as we can. Let's keep those stress levels down. Right. So we now have, Bob says, sounds similar to once I used in a database, and once an item had data entered into it, it would automatically copy paste the info into another item. Bob, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So everybody, check out Bob's contribution in the chat. Yeah, so there's a situation where somebody put a value in and then something else happened. So that other thing might be really useful, but it might confuse the user. What if it's something that the user doesn't want to happen? Can you imagine how frustrating that would be if something kept happening without you asking it to happen? And this is why we've got to use worksheet change, workbook change macros very carefully. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to say message box here. So now we can do some testing. And these macros are, you know, notoriously difficult to test and get working. So it might take us a few goes tonight. Just going to stretch out my shoulder a bit here. Okay, so let's go and make a change to the worksheet. And then let's see if anything happens here. So 7:30. Okay, nothing happening yet. Okay, let's see what's going on then. So is this in the right place? Okay, I can see our problem here. So having said, make sure you put the code in the right place, I'm pretty sure I put it in the wrong place. Yeah, Bart said he used it to put his name on the version of the status bar. Okay, good. So this code, I'm going to cut it, Control X, go to the data. I suppose we call this a module here. I'll call it an object. And then it seems to be in the right place. So let's go ahead and do the thing that should trigger this macro. Change the worksheet. Make a change in the worksheet. 7:30, and there we can see our message box flashing up. So if you've never seen this before, it can feel very unnatural. It should feel unnatural because it won't be something you're used to here. You know, we're just making a change. We can see the message box flashing up there. But if you're getting this, maybe you're thinking this opens up a world of possibility, and I've got to say a world of danger, a world of risk for the programmer. Lots of good stuff we could do, but we could also cause problems like this. So we've got to be careful. Let me know in the chat, how is this going to help our particular situation? And maybe Cameron, you could help us as well here. How is this going to help our particular situation? Remember our initial problem here. When we change this list, this value in the end time, it doesn't always appear in the list. It's giving us an invalid combination of times. So can anybody see what we could do? At the moment, our code is just flashing up a message box. We want to do more than that, don't we? We don't just want to flash up a message box. In fact, I don't think we want to flash up a message box at all. We'd actually, when there's a change, and if, this is the key condition, if the cell that's changed is the start time cell, then we want to reset this value in the end time to 0, or just clear that end time cell. Can you see that? Yeah, Cameron's saying, yeah, the purpose here is we can get correct times. Exactly, or rather, more precisely, we can eliminate incorrect times. This is so important in coding, and everybody complains on YouTube that my sessions are so slow. Can't you just show us the code, just give us the answer? But I'm trying to teach the real skills behind the code that are going to allow you to do it. You've got to make sure you can talk out loud, talk the code out loud. If you can't describe it in English or in your own language, but what's your native language? It might be Flemish or French maybe, or something. You've got to be able to speak it out loud in your own language. If you can't do that, you're not going to be able to program it. Or you might be lucky and kind of get the programming right once. You're not going to get it right consistently. So we want to say to Excel, if the address of the cell that's been changed is B4, then we want to clear cell C4. Yeah. And Bob's saying, yeah, if end time does not equal one of the valid time, then display the prompt. So Bob also is articulating the logic. Bob, you've gone one level further there by saying, actually, well, if this time is valid, if this time does appear in the list for the start time, then we'd actually want to keep the time. That's true. That's true. A disadvantage of that approach would be, well, A, it's more complicated to code, but possible to code. B, the code is getting a bit longer. So remember, this code is going to execute kind of out of nowhere for the user. The user's not expecting it. The user's not mentally prepared for a macro to run. So we want to keep it super short, so the user doesn't really notice. If it takes time, that's going to frustrate the user. So how do we do this? How can we say to Excel, articulate our logic? We want to be able to say to Excel, if the cell that's been changed is cell B4, we want to do something. That's our logic. Well, what have we got here? We've got by-val target as range. So when we use this worksheet change macro, and you'll see this in lots of the worksheet workbook event macros that we're covering tonight, we get this kind of auto variable declaration. We get a declaration, you know, we're familiar with this target as range, but we use this by val. Not absolutely sure why it's by val rather than dim. We get a variable automatically declared. What's a variable? Well, we know a variable is a place to store information. That's all it is. It's just to help us as programmers. Let's put this value in a drawer, then let's bring it out later and use it for something. So how might we use it? Let me know in the chat, how might we use it? Well, in this case, let's first try to see how this is working. I'm just going to say target.address here. And then what do we get? So I'm going to go ahead, change this value, and we can see B4. Okay, interesting. It's come up with B4. What if I change this cell? And it's come up with C4 here. See, that's interesting for us. That's interesting for us. Yeah, camera's saying if the target value changes, we can amend another cell based on that. Exactly. That's the kind of logic we're looking at. The specific logic we want here, let's just change another cell, another random cell. The specific logic we want here, well, the user's going to be changing other cells, using the spreadsheet to do other things. So we want to say in our macro, if the cell that was changed was this specific cell, we need to do something. If it wasn't that specific cell, then just ignore it. We don't need to do anything. This is what we're trying to do. So if we can say, you can see already it's kind of getting on my nerves, this worksheet change thing. I just cleared a cell and it executed the macro. So hopefully you can get a feel for how this might frustrate the user as well, which is why, again, we're going to be very precise about how we're using these powerful weapons. Okay, so how might we articulate this? Say if, and here's our conditional statement. I think Bart said we're going to need a conditional statement. You're absolutely right, Bart. Equals, and then it's B4. But I think we're going to need the $signs. And let's have a message box saying this is the start time cell. And message box, of course. And then ends if. So can you see what's going to happen here? And this is one of those intermediary steps. Again, in my lectures, I always say, don't try to do it all at the same time. Try to do it step by step. This is a nice intermediary step that's going to move us towards like a base camp to allow us to reach the summit of this VBA task. So what's going to happen here? So what's going to happen, let me know in the chat. What's going to happen if I change the value in C4? What's going to happen? If I change the value in B4, then what's going to happen? Bart says, can we use the numbers of rows? Yes, we could use the row number, Bart. We could use the row number. I'm reluctant to do that because, well, what's going to happen if you use a whole row number, then this macro is going to trigger for all the cells on a particular row. That's a lot of cells. So you might have the macro triggering when you don't want it to trigger. Okay, so as I said, when I'm using these, I want to be very specific about when the macro triggers, and Bob is on the money. So yeah, if we change C4, nothing's going to happen because we're going to go to this conditional statement. Excel is going to look at the condition. The condition is not met because the target.address, the address property of the target variable, which is the cell that we changed, well, that's going to equal C4. So let's demonstrate that now. So I'm going to make some changes here. Okay, first I'm going to have to change this. In fact, let's just change a random cell again. Type my name in here. Okay, we can see no changes there, but the macro did run. The macro did run. And I'll prove that in a second that the macro is running. Let's make a change here. Okay, love it. And we have got our message. Let's make a change again. Do you ever do this? Once you've got a macro working, you kind of celebrate. Celebrate by running it multiple times. Oh, it's poetry in motion. It really is something poetic when you get the things working there. Bart says, okay, I understand. Cameron, absolutely right, is saying only if B4 is selected. Good. But I'm going to prove to you that the macro is running. So let's put a little else in here. And this means if the condition is not met, and let's say is not the start time cell, not the start time cell, There we go. Bob says, I missed the beginning, but are the drop downs? That's right, Bob. Yeah, so the drop downs are, so across here, these are the start times across the top in row 2, and these are the end times that apply to the start time at the top of the column. So for example, if the end time is 8:30, then we can see we're going to get all of the, sorry, if the start time is 8:30, we're going to get all of the end times along here. That was in last week's Members Monday, Bob, so you can go back and you can see how we put this together. Of course, it's a dynamic list. Cool. So got our conditional statement here. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, it really helps me in the chat. Even if people just say, I understand, or yes, I'm following along, you know, that really, really helps me. Okay, so what are we expecting to happen now? So if I make a change here, type my name in again. Okay, this is not the start time cell. Good. And then let's go to this cell here. This is the start cell. Okay, this is the start time cell. There we go. But it says I'm thinking to just a case conditions, but not a if conditions. I think the structure we're building here, Bart, should do the job for us. The structure that we're building here. So we can go ahead now. We can delete this. And then obviously we don't want a message box to flash up. Remember, in a practical sense, we're just looking to clear this cell. That's what we're looking to do. So what code do we want here to replace this message box code? Anybody tell me in the chat, what code do we want here to replace this message box code? Very simply, we can say range C4. Bart, don't worry. Bart's saying sorry. Not a problem. And then we can say clear. Very good, Cameron. Excellent. Yeah, I was going to say clear is one thing, but what's the difference between clear and clear contents? Does anybody know? Why would you say clear contents and not just clear? Perhaps someone will say in the chat. Give you a few seconds. So clear, of course, if we just say clear, then we'd clear everything, including the formatting of the cell. So this clear contents, super useful. It's just going to clear the value and it will retain the formatting. So super useful. Okay, so what's going to happen here? Well, if the cell we change is not B4, then nothing's going to happen. If the cell that we do change, and here's the moment of truth, we've been building up to this for 20 minutes. Here we go. If we change that, okay, did you see that? Did you see it in action? So keep your eye on C4 here. Keep your eye on C4. So when we change this time, we can see that value disappears. Cameron says clear contents will clear everything. I think clear contents only clears the value, whereas clear will clear the formats as well, Cameron, I believe. So this is what we're looking at, and this is what I call a nice, smooth example of a workbook, in this case a worksheet change event triggered macro. Lots of technical words there, but all it means is when the user changes the sheet, something happens that's desirable for the user. So we're helping the user. So let's make another change here. Now you can see how smooth that is. There's no screen flashing. We're not going to another sheet. There's no message box. It's just very nice and smooth. And the reason I demonstrated this example was I worked on a project this year. In fact, I started it last year and extended it this year, where we did exactly this, where we had a situation where we were doing inputs. And this project is for a recycling company in the north of England. And they have input lists, dynamic lists like this. So they have one list and then the next list depends on the input of the first list. And we were having this problem, because people were making an input in the dependent list, then going back to the first list and changing the entry there. So we were having the possibility, only a possibility, but the possibility of invalid combinations, which would create problems later. And this is a great example of how you've got to be on top of validation. Yeah, because you might say, well, let's make the programming work for those invalid combinations later. That's not the most efficient way to do it. The most efficient way is to be proactive, to anticipate the problems, and this comes with experience, anticipate with the problems, and then to deal with them when you're setting up the workbook, when you're thinking about how are all these inputs going to work. Well, what tools have we got to help with data input? We've got drop-down menus. You might have a user form to help you with data input. You might have some other feature in your workbook. I'd put one of those in, get it working, tested with the client, and then later, just as the icing on the cake. That's how these workbook and worksheet change macros should be treated. The icing on the cake, I would say. Then you'll put this in towards the end of the project. When you're trying to improve the efficiency, the smoothness, I like this word slickness, to make the spreadsheet feel slick. Very smooth functionality. That's when we'd be looking at putting this kind of function in. So let me know in the chat, are you following this? And do you think you're going to do it yourself? I'd love to be able to show you this file, but obviously it's all client confidential, unfortunately. But if there's requests to see that, then maybe I'll be able to kind of anonymize it and show you. Actually, I was speaking to the client today. Good. So this is my first application. I have another application which I'd like to show you. And again, I only really want to demonstrate stuff that I use regularly in my work. I'm reluctant to demonstrate stuff where it's cool coding, because don't get me wrong, cool coding is great for building theoretical understanding, but there's a problem that in the real world, people are trying to apply stuff that's too sophisticated. Yeah, generally the coding should be simple. It should look simple. It should be easy to debug, easy to work with, as should the formulae. This is the best way to do Excel projects. Okay, excellent. Bob and Cameron saying thank you. Seems to be one more person watching, so I'm keen to see who our other member is. But this person's probably like me. When I'm on the internet, I've got people I've followed on YouTube for 8 years and watched all of their videos, hundreds of videos, and never, probably never liked a video, so it's okay if we've got people watching who don't want to participate in the chat. I do understand that. Bart says, like the file I send. Good. Yes, Bart. So Bart is referring to a file he sent me where things have got quite complicated, and we had a dialogue about this file. But it's an example, I think, of where, and this is nobody's fault. It's not a criticism of you, Bart, certainly. You're my man. But yes, the coding is too big. So it's almost like, what would be a good example? If I was building, what's a good example here? Anyway, you're giving someone tools that are kind of too powerful for the level that they're at. And again, I'm sorry if that sounds patronizing. It's not meant to sound patronizing. I always take it back to sport, because I did a lot of sport when I was young, and I got a lot of sports coaching. And if we went and watched Barcelona, so Lionel Messi, the best player in the world, if we went and watched their training session, what are they doing in their training session, Barcelona? So what's the best stuff they can do? Well, Messi, he can do overhead kicks. He can do crazy skills, all kinds of stuff. Is that what he's practicing in his training? How often does he practice overhead kicks, Messi? Maybe once a year, twice a year. When you go and watch Barcelona training, they're doing side passes, basic skills, basic fitness. The goalkeeper's doing basic handling. I used to be a goalkeeper in football. They're practicing the basics. That's because the basics work. And that's what I've realized over the years. So I don't want you to, to invite you to a football training session, people who maybe don't have the basics, I don't know what level the people are here, and then saying, right, the first thing we're going to do is practice overhead kicks. That would be silly and possibly dangerous. Yeah. Don't want anybody to go outside and practice their overhead kicks now, but hopefully that illustrates the points. And with coding, don't get me wrong, I love the cool coding. Yeah. But I think we've got a responsibility as teachers in the community to teach the stuff that people are actually going to use. That's why I'm reluctant to just focus on the coding. Anyway, let's look at another example. So what about this problem in spreadsheets? Do you ever have this problem? And how do you get out of it? So say you go onto a sheet, and we've got a sheet here. I'm going to go back to the data sheet. Okay, and then you're like, where's the data gone? Hello, anybody home? Where's the data gone? And it turns out that, well, actually you're on column BA and you're on row 122. This happens all the time, particularly in files with lots of data, people going up and down data sets, people going across columns and things. This kind of thing can happen all the time. So in my Excel projects, and again, this is icing on the cake. This is something I'll do towards the end of Excel projects. This is like an overhead kick for messy. I put a routine in so that when people activate a sheet, it automatically takes them back to cell A1. So all of this scrolling work I'm doing now, yes, give me bad fingers. All of this scrolling work we don't have to do because Excel automatically takes us back to cell A1. And it's really smooth. It doesn't waste time. It doesn't frustrate the user. It supports the user. All of these conditions have to be met in order to justify one of these workbook or worksheet change macros. So does anybody know how you might do that? If I was your customer, I said, listen, people are tired of scrolling across this sheet. Can you make sure when we click on the sheet, we start on cell A1, which is a perfectly reasonable request. Indeed, it's a request I've had in my career before. So again, you can guess from the theme of the lecture what might help us here. So we've already had a look at some of the options when we look at the sheet objects. We've also got the workbook object here. And again, open this up, go to workbook, just like we went to worksheet before, go to worksheet, and then just familiarize yourself with some of these options. Should you use all of these options? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Might you use a few of these options in your career? Maybe, in the right circumstances. Could you get through your career without using any of these options? Absolutely. That's also possible. So you have to understand all these things before you get into this. But we've got all kinds of options here, and these are fairly nicely written in kind of layman's terms so we can understand. When we activate the window, activate the file, after the file is saved, before the file is closed, you could flash up some kind of custom message there. When a new chart is put in the file, that's not an event I've ever used, but it's interesting. When the file is open, you can have a little welcome message. I've seen those a lot of time in Excel, and they just frustrate people after a while, but that is possible. When you activate a sheet, something could happen. So let's translate back into layman's terms. So our brief was to make a macro that executes when the sheet is activated. Okay, we've got some ideas in the code here. Cameron, control home. Yeah, is that the shortcut to move to the top left cell? That sounds pretty cool. Bob says not sure of the code, but similar to go to A1. Yep. Cameron says exactly range A1 dot select. That's not all of it, but that works sometimes. I'm going to show you the one that works all the time. And yeah, Bart's absolutely right. So use this workbook and make sure if you click on select sheet. So I think it's sheet activate, but I'm just going to have a quick look through some of these other options. Anything else? I don't think it's window activate. That's kind of activating the whole file. Okay, let's try sheet activate. You also would have noticed that when we click on workbook, we have by default Excel put some code in there for us. Not sure why that is. Maybe somebody knows, but again, Excel sets up a little routine for us. We've got 2 lines of code, the opening and closing line, and again, this is cool. Again, we have a kind of default variable declared for us that might be useful to us. So how are we going to get this working? Okay, right. I've just realized, you know what? I've always wondered why people use SH as the name of a worksheet variable. I've always wondered, why do people do that? It's SH, it's just not informative. You know, I always prefer longer variable names because it's easier to distinguish between them. It's more informative. I've just seen that, yeah, Excel by default suggests SH as the name as an object variable here, but in this case representing a sheet. So maybe that's where that came from. Right, let's try this then. And again, intermediary step involving message boxes. And let's say sh, which is the name of this kind of default variable that we've been given. And then just see if when we change the sheets, go to the whole desktop view here. So I'm going to change the sheet, and then let's just see if something happens. We should have a message box flashing up, and there's our message box. And that has the sheet name on it. Message box flashing up, and there's our sheet name. Lovely. So that's the most difficult part in the way. We've got Excel to, we've kind of proven to ourselves that something is happening. No, that's an issue when you're working with worksheet change, workbook change macros. Is something actually happening? How are these macros being triggered? It's quite difficult to kind of visualize how they're being triggered because we're used to using buttons to trigger macros. So what we can do now is, now I'm not sure if range a1.select is going to work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But let's see if it works. So sheet 1, I'm going to scroll down. So we're now on row 60. I'm going to go to the data sheet and then go back to sheet 1. And in this case, yeah, it has worked well. So that seems to work well. But you can see, again, this is, for me, is an example of an effective application of this technique. And I've seen many, many ineffective applications because it's very smooth. You know, we couldn't even see what happened there. And you might say to me, but Chris, what if the client, is working on row 51, is working on row 51, goes to get some information from the data sheet and then wants to come back to row 51. I'm with you. I feel your pain. The customer might want to do that. What would you do in that situation, by the way? What would you do in that situation? If you have a customer that said, listen, usually I want to go back to A1, so I like the functionality there, but occasionally, I'd rather stay on whichever row I was on. What might you do in that situation? Can we cater for that client need, or do we have to say to the client, sorry, we can't do that? Which you do have to say to customers a lot on IT projects. What I have done, and we won't implement it today, but what I have done in the past is you can have a little box in the spreadsheet somewhere saying something like return to cell A1, and then just a yes or no, yes or no drop down menu. In the code, you can then put a conditional statement in saying if the client has chosen to switch this on, i.e. if the value in cell B2 is yes, then do this. Otherwise, don't do this. So similar to how we had a conditional statement in the other macro, we've got a conditional statement here. This conditional statement might say, if the mode is switched on, do it. And if the mode is not switched on, then don't do it. So you can build in the flexibility there. Okay. Let me show you the code I use I say, I think it's active window. And then we say scroll row is the property we want. Scroll column and end with. There we go. Yeah, Cameron says he wasn't sure about that question. Yeah, let me know if you understood my my answer there, Cameron. I mean, there we're getting into advanced solutions, but clients love that kind of thing. Really. It's not the first thing you should do on the project, but if you can get to the stage where the model's working, the core value is being delivered, you can sprinkle these things on like icing on the cake, and they can take a client from satisfied to, you know, your biggest fan. And things like having settings, you know, for a lot of people, the concept of having settings in a spreadsheet is like, whoa, you know, that's just beyond their comprehension. That you could have settings, you know, like on your phone, you have settings on your phone. Now, in all of the stuff I give to customers, I have settings in there. So, and for example, one of the things in the settings would be, do you want to automatically return to cell A1? Another setting might be, do you want to automatically clear the end time cell when the start cell value is cleared? So this kind of stuff can go into settings, and settings might be, you might have a little user form that has settings, but I keep it simple. I'll have a sheet in the file called settings. That's where you can store all of that information. Anyway, this macro still seems to be working well. Just to prove this, I'm going to switch off the previous line of code. Not sure why I indented this. Going to switch off the previous line of code just by making it a comment. Put the inverted comma in there. Again, run this code. And you can see we got back to row 1 at the top there. So seems to be doing the same thing. I must have had a situation previously where this didn't work, and unfortunately I can't remember when, but there's a reason why I started using this. Okay, so I recommend this. You know, this may work, you know, selectively. So maybe if you're using it on your files for personal use, this will be enough. If I was giving it to a customer, I recommend using this code. And these values you can, of course, change. You can change these values. And this code I've used to create navigation systems in files, you know, to get a client to a particular row, to get a client to a particular column. This code is going to work for doing that kind of thing as well. Good. So let me know any final questions in the chat. I think it's been a good session, really good participation. Bob, Cameron, and Bart. I've had a great time. Let me know any final questions in the chat. I'll do a little summary. I mean, this is a cool technique. There's no doubt about it. It's a cool technique, but we've got to handle it with care. Yeah. These can get really confusing. If you're running a long macro from an event in Excel, that could confuse the customer. So we've got to be very careful when we're using this, that our code is smooth and efficient, that our code has been tested, and that it's really delivering value for the customer. If it's frustrating, even if it's just a little bit frustrating. I mentioned before the welcome message. I don't see the point of putting a welcome message in a file. Yes, we could do that quite easily. We go to Workbook and then Workbook open. Or is it just open? Yeah, we've got the open event here. This event here. This will allow us to flash up a message when people open the file, but that's going to become annoying after a while. Okay, so I want you to really think critically. Is this really delivering value for the customer, or am I just excited about using the cool code? Don't get me wrong. I get excited about using the cool code, but is the customer going to be excited about it? Okay, so always thinking about things critically and from the customer's point of view. And if you can understand those things, that you've got to think critically, appreciate the pros and cons, and you have a genuinely customer-centric approach, you're trying to create value for your customer, then you can have some success with this kind of technique, as long as you understand those things, and that it comes at the end. It's the icing on the cake, this kind of technique. This isn't core value. This is added value. Added value without the core value never works. Core value without the added value usually works fine. Good. So Bob says he's good for today. Thanks, Bob, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed your first Members Monday. Absolutely pumped to have you here today. Cameron said, good so far, no questions. Thank you, Cameron. Well, Cameron, your idea gave me the idea for doing this session, so I hope you got some value out of it. Now, Cameron, you also had the idea for sensitivity analysis. That's possible, but sensitivity analysis is one of those words where one of those things that confuses a lot of people. So I'd want to know a little more about the context. Okay, if you want to do sensitivity analysis. But maybe, Bob, have you got a particular application you want to do next week? Or Cameron or Bart, if you've got particular applications you want to do next week. So far, I don't have an idea for next week. So I'm very happy to look at some of your ideas and to create some value for you. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you, Bart. It's Bart saying have a good time. I've had a great time. It's the best thing, Members Monday, and to think that you guys are supporting the channel really makes me very happy indeed. So thank you so much, guys. I'll see